6:14 a.m., February 7th, 2026. Jacksonville, Florida. 12 NCIS special agents moved through a residential cul-de-sac on Harbor Island Drive, headlights off. 2 unmarked bureau vehicles sealed the north exit. A third unit held at the corner. Total estimated value of stolen government property, $38 million. The cargo had been gone for 19 years. The man they were coming for was 61 years old. He had a pension, a consulting firm. A boat docked at the St. John's River Marina, 2 miles from his front door. By all visible measures, Dale Wickham had lived a quiet retirement since leaving federal service in 2012. The warrant in the lead agent's jacket had been issued in 2010. It had never been served. It had never been formally withdrawn. It had simply sat, dormant, technically active, filed in a system nobody was actively querying anymore, until 11 weeks ago. One detail kept nagging at the archivist who found it: a single signature on a cargo release form from August 2007 that didn't match the rest of the document's formatting. Small enough that 3 separate NCIS investigators had missed it across 3 separate reviews spanning 3 years. The archivist wasn't an investigator. She was a contract employee hired to digitize legacy records. And the anomaly she flagged would reopen the largest unresolved procurement theft in Naval Station Norfolk's history. This is the story of how a cold warrant, dormant for 15 years, finally reached the front door of the man who created the gap it was written to close. The morning of August 14th, 2007, began without incident at Naval Station Norfolk's Pier 12 receiving dock. A scheduled inventory transfer. 340 pallets of classified navigation electronics designated for Pacific Fleet refit had arrived via civilian freight contractor 2 days ahead of schedule. The cargo was logged, manifested, and cleared for temporary secure storage pending onward transfer. By midnight, every pallet was gone. The disappearance wasn't discovered until the following Thursday, when a Navy supply officer conducting a routine pre-transfer count found the secure storage bay empty. The manifest listed 340 pallets received. The bay contained 0. The discrepancy was logged as a Priority 1 inventory anomaly and escalated within hours to NCIS. What investigators found when they began pulling records was systematic. The manifest had been properly signed at every stage: receiving, storage authorization, release. Every checkpoint had a signature. Every signature matched a credentialed civilian employee. The paperwork trail was clean in the way that only deliberate construction produces. The freight contractor listed on the release documentation, a company called Meridian Coastal Logistics, registered in Delaware, had been incorporated 14 months prior. It held a valid GSA contract vehicle. It had processed 11 previous naval shipments without incident, all routine, none classified. Its principals were listed as 2 individuals, a managing director with a Virginia business address and a logistics coordinator in Maryland. By the time NCIS began attempting to reach those principals, Meridian Coastal Logistics had already filed for voluntary dissolution. The Virginia address was a registered agent office, a mailbox service that had processed the dissolution paperwork the previous week. The Maryland coordinator had never existed at that address. The company had evaporated. In its place, a paper trail that went nowhere. 3 civilian logistics employees at Naval Station Norfolk were identified as persons of interest. All 3 had access to the cargo receiving system during the relevant window. All 3 were interviewed. None were detained. 1. A GS-14 logistics supervisor named Dale Wickham was interviewed twice. He produced documentation showing he had been on approved leave during the August 12th-14th window and had returned to duty on August 15th, the day after the cargo disappeared. His personnel records were clean. His access logs showed no anomalies during the window in question. His interview responses were consistent across both sessions. NCIS's forensic accountants found no unusual financial activity in his disclosed accounts. The investigation ran for 3 years. It produced no charges. In 2010, with no recoverable assets, no identifiable suspects, and a freight contractor that existed only on paper, the file was closed. The $38 million loss was absorbed into a supplemental Navy appropriations request as unrecoverable inventory shrinkage. The line item drew no congressional inquiry. The warrant prepared for Dale Wickham, based on circumstantial evidence investigators considered insufficient for prosecution, was filed rather than withdrawn. An oversight or a procedural backup? Nobody followed up on it. The file went into storage, then into archive. Then, eventually, into boxes sitting in a climate-controlled annex at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, waiting for the digital age to catch up with them. In the fall of 2025, The Navy's accelerated Indo-Pacific logistics modernization program generated a secondary administrative requirement. Legacy procurement and supply chain records dating back to 2000 needed to be digitized, indexed, and cross-referenced against current contractor databases. The project was contracted out to a records management firm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. The firm deployed a team of 6 contract archivists to the Portsmouth annex in October 2025. One of those archivists was a woman named Sandra Okafor. She had a background in document management and an approach to anomaly flagging that her supervisor later described as almost compulsive. She cross-referenced timestamps, matched signature formatting against institutional templates, and flagged anything that didn't conform to Naval Administrative Directive standards. On November 19, 2025, Okafor was processing a batch of 2007 cargo manifests when she encountered document package 07 NRF 3847. It was a standard multi-page release manifest for a bulk cargo transfer at Norfolk's Pier 12. The document looked clean. Proper headers, correct station codes, appropriate civilian employee signatures at each stage, except one. The NCIS release authorization on page 7 bore a signature identified as belonging to a special agent whose name and badge number appeared in the document header. The signature looked right, but the date stamp beneath it used a /separated format, August 14th 07, while every other date stamp in the document used the standard Naval Administrative hyphen format, 14 AOG 07. One formatting inconsistency. One line on one page of a document reviewed by multiple investigators across a 3-year investigation. Okafor flagged it with a yellow sticky note and set it aside. At the end of her shift, she photographed it with her work tablet and submitted it through the firm's anomaly logging system as a formatting irregularity. The notation reached the Portsmouth Annex project supervisor the following morning. The project supervisor was a retired Navy commander with a logistics background. He looked at the photograph. He recognized the NCIS special agent's name in the document header. He knew that agent's name wasn't associated with the Norfolk receiving dock in 2007. He made a phone call. Within 48 hours, the original document package had been transferred to NCIS's Washington field office. A forensic document examiner was assigned. The analysis took 11 days. The conclusion? The NCIS released signature on page 7 of Manifest 07 NRF 3847 was a forgery. The ink chemistry, the pressure signature, and the date stamp formatting were inconsistent with the document's authentic pages. Someone had inserted a forged authorization page into the manifest, after the original document had been assembled and before it had been filed. The NCIS agent, whose name appeared on the forged page, had been stationed in Norfolk in 2007. He had never been assigned to the Pier 12 receiving dock. He had not authorized any cargo releases that month. He was, at the time of the discovery, retired and living in Annapolis. His name had been used because it appeared on other legitimate documents in the same batch. Routine administrative cross-references a sophisticated forger might have identified by reading through the surrounding paperwork. Someone with access to those records had pulled a real name and used it. The forensic conclusion carried one additional piece of information. The insertion point, the physical placement of the forged page within the document, indicated it had been inserted before the document was bound and filed at the station's records office. That meant someone with physical access to the records office had made the substitution, likely within days of the August 14th transfer. 3 people had held records office access authorization during the relevant window. One of them was Dale Wickham. I spent time going through the leave documentation Wickham had produced for his 2007 alibi, and one detail kept nagging at me. Not the dates themselves, but the approval chain. His leave request had been approved by a civilian supervisor who left federal service 8 months later, citing personal reasons. That supervisor's subsequent employment history had never been part of the original NCIS investigation file. Nobody had pulled the thread. NCIS's major procurement fraud unit picked it up in December 2025. What they found when they began tracing Wickham's financial history, not just his disclosed accounts from 2007, but his full financial footprint from 2006 through 2012, was a pattern that had been invisible as long as investigators were looking only at bank accounts registered in his name. The money had moved through a structure that was, for 2007, reasonably sophisticated. 3 shell companies, each registered in different states, each holding a small portfolio of what appeared to be routine logistics consulting contracts. The companies had filed taxes, paid quarterly estimated payments, and maintained enough transactional volume to avoid triggering automated screening flags. What the retroactive audit identified, using forensic accounting tools that hadn't existed in 2010, was a series of wire transfers from 2 of those companies to a 4th entity, a maritime freight brokerage registered in Singapore. The brokerage had then processed payments to a Cyprus-registered trading company. The Cyprus entity dissolved in 2011. The total value of trace transfers, $38 million, distributed across 14 months following the August 2007 theft. The components themselves, 340 pallets of classified navigation hardware, had been resold. The buyers, based on the Cyprus Trading Company's partial records recovered through an Interpol request in January 2026, appeared to be entities operating in the defense electronics aftermarket. Specifically, buyers in Southeast Asia who specialized in legacy navigation systems compatible with older vessel platforms. The hardware was gone, absorbed into a global grey market for defense electronics more than a decade ago. Recovering it was not a realistic objective, but the money trail was real, and it led back to Dale Wickham. Here's what's most surprising about this case. It wasn't the financial architecture that broke it open. It was the leave request. The same leave documentation Wickham had used as his alibi in 2007 became the pivot point when NCIS analysts noticed that his civilian supervisor's departure from federal service had never been investigated. The supervisor, a GS-13 logistics coordinator named Raymond Eds, had resigned in April 2008. His post-government employment had taken him to a maritime consulting firm in Virginia Beach. The same Virginia Beach where one of Wickham's shell companies had maintained a registered address. Here's what this tells us about how procurement fraud at this scale actually operates. It doesn't require technical sophistication. It requires institutional knowledge. Wickham understood exactly how the Records Office processed documents because he had worked in that system for over a decade. He knew which formatting inconsistencies would be invisible to human reviewers under time pressure. He knew which signatures carried weight and which were routine. He knew that a dissolved freight contractor would slow investigators down long enough for the cargo to move. He wasn't working with advanced tools. He was working with patient, practiced knowledge of how bureaucratic systems fail to check themselves. Raymond Eds was arrested on January 29, 2026, at his residence in Virginia Beach. He was 64 years old and had been running a private maritime consulting practice for the previous 8 years. The charging documents alleged that Eds had received $1. $4 million in payments from Wickham's shell company structure between 2008 and 2011, in exchange for facilitating the record substitution and suppressing a secondary inventory review scheduled for September 2007. That secondary review, which would almost certainly have identified the missing pallets within weeks rather than months, had been quietly rescheduled twice and then cancelled entirely. Eds had signed the cancellation authorization. At the time, it appeared to be routine administrative adjustment. Nobody questioned it. A third individual was identified through the financial trace, a former civilian contractor named Gary Pethick, who had processed the Meridian Coastal Logistics paperwork at the GSA contract vehicle level. Pethick had worked as a procurement specialist at the Defense Logistics Agency before moving to private contracting work in 2009. His role had been to ensure that Meridian's GSA credentials appeared clean to the receiving docs verification systems. Pethick was 57 years old and living in Tampa when NCIS identified him as a material suspect in January 2026. He was placed under surveillance for 11 days. His communications were monitored under a federal court order. He made no contact with Wickham or Eds during that period. A fact investigators later interpreted as indicating that the three men had maintained strict communications discipline since the dissolution of their scheme, nearly 15 years earlier. You'd think 15 years of silence would mean they'd stopped being careful. It didn't. NCIS surveillance teams noted that Pethick ran what appeared to be a genuinely legitimate consulting practice. He paid his taxes. He had no known contact with defense procurement channels. He had, by all appearances, cashed out and gone quiet. The obstacle NCIS faced in the final weeks before the arrest warrants were served was establishing sufficient documentary evidence to meet the evidentiary threshold for conspiracy charges without alerting any of the three men that they were under active investigation. The financial forensics were solid for Wickham. The AIDS connection was established through the shell company records. But the Pethick link, running through the GSA contractor database and a series of payments that predated the main financial structure, required a separate forensic accounting chain that the major procurement fraud unit had to reconstruct without access to the original Meridian Coastal Logistics records, which had been destroyed as part of the company's dissolution. The solution came from an unexpected direction. The GSA maintains a contractor performance database that includes payment records going back to the mid-1990s. An analyst working the Pethick angle cross-referenced the database against Meridian's known contractor ID and found a series of modification requests, routine amendments to contract scope. That had been processed through the system in the 12 months before the August 2007 theft. Each modification had been approved by a contracting officer whose identification number appeared in the database. That contracting officer's identification number belonged to Gary Pethick. The chain was complete. What do you think? Did the Navy's procurement oversight system fail? Or was this the kind of scheme that no institutional safeguard could realistically have caught? The arrest warrant package was finalised on February 4th, 2026. 3 warrants, 3 targets, 3 simultaneous operations across 2 states. The coordinating authority was NCIS's Major Procurement Fraud Unit in conjunction with the FBI's Jacksonville Field Office, the FBI's Norfolk Resident Agency, and a task force unit operating out of Tampa. The timing question wasn't straightforward. The original dormant warrant for Wickham, the one filed and never withdrawn in 2010, was still technically active in the federal warrant system. A legal review determined it required supplemental documentation to reflect the new evidence developed in 2025 and 2026, but the warrant number itself could be carried forward. The supervising federal magistrate in the Eastern District of Virginia approved the supplemental documentation on February 5th, 2026. The warrant was active again after 15 years of dormancy. And this time, there was an address. Put yourself in the position of the NCIS coordinating agent for a moment. You're managing simultaneous arrest operations across 3 locations: Jacksonville, Virginia Beach, and Tampa, with 3 separate tactical elements that need to move within a 30-minute window of each other to prevent any communication between the targets. You have a 15-year-old warrant on your primary target, a 61-year-old man who has lived a completely unremarkable life for the past 14 years. You have 2 secondary targets in their late 50s and mid-60s. None of them have criminal records. None of them are assessed as likely to present physical resistance. But the stakes of any operational leak are enormous. If any one of the 3 men is tipped off, the entire case could unravel. The physical evidence of the original theft is gone. The components are in Southeast Asia, untraceable. The case rests almost entirely on financial records and document forensics. If the targets had time to lawyer up and contest the forensic chain before arrest, the prosecution timeline extends by months and the evidentiary advantage narrows. The window had to be tight, and it had to be simultaneous. NCIS selected 6:14 a.m. on Tuesday, February 7th, 2026, early enough to catch all 3 targets at their residences before they began their daily routines, late enough for full daylight to support the tactical elements. The Jacksonville operation would serve the original 2010 warrant, now supplemented. The Virginia Beach operation would execute under the new warrant for Raymond Eds. The Tampa operation would execute under the new warrant for Gary Pethick. One complication emerged the evening before the operations. Dale Wickham's vehicle, a silver F-250 registered to his consulting firm, had been logged by a Jacksonville PD license plate reader at 11:47 p.m. on February 6th, moving southbound on I-95. The NCIS coordinating agent was notified at 12:23 a.m. For about 40 minutes, there was genuine uncertainty about whether the primary target was in transit, whether he was, for some unrelated reason, away from the residence that 12 agents were preparing to approach in 6 hours. The vehicle was located at 1:08 a.m. Wickham had driven to a marina on the south side of Jacksonville and returned home. His boat was still at its slip. No contact with any known associate was identified. He had gone to the marina and come back. Nobody knew why. The reason, if there was one, was never established. At 6:09 a.m., the Jacksonville tactical element was in position on Harbor Island Drive. 12 NCIS agents, 2 vehicles sealing the exit points. The element leader confirmed via encrypted channel that Virginia Beach and Tampa were also in position. At 6:14 a.m., all 3 operations executed simultaneously. In Jacksonville, NCIS agents approached the front door of Dale Wickham's residence on foot. The doorbell camera recorded the approach. Wickham answered the door in a bathrobe approximately 40 seconds after the first knock. He did not attempt to close the door. He did not speak. He looked at the agents, looked at the warrant document being held at eye level, and said, according to the arresting agent's subsequent report, "I figured." 2 words. 19 years in the making. He was placed in handcuffs in his front doorway at 6:16 a.m. His consulting firm's office, located in a commercial suite downtown, was simultaneously searched under a separate warrant. Agents recovered financial records, encrypted storage devices, and a physical document archive that included, in a locked filing cabinet, a folder containing what appeared to be original correspondence related to the Meridian coastal logistics structure. Wickham had kept records, either because he thought they were safely hidden or because some part of him couldn't bring himself to destroy them. In Virginia Beach, Raymond Ades answered the door at 6:17 a.m. He said nothing. He held out his hands. In Tampa, Gary Pethick was not immediately present when agents knocked. There were 90 seconds of uncertainty before he appeared at the door from the interior of the residence. He had been in a back bedroom. He was cooperative. All three men were in federal custody by 6:22 a.m. Total elapsed time from first knock to final custody confirmation across all three simultaneous operations, 8 minutes. One detail that stuck with me in the post-arrest documentation. The folder in Wickham's filing cabinet contained a single photograph. It was a picture of Naval Station Norfolk's Pier 12, taken from the water. No date on it, no label. Nobody could establish with certainty when it had been taken or why Wickham had kept it. The photograph was logged as evidence and placed in the case file. It remains unexplained. The initial federal indictment, unsealed February 7th, 2026, charged all three men with conspiracy to commit theft of government property, wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Wickham faced an additional charge of identity fraud for the use of the NCIS special agent's name on the forged manifest page. The money laundering charges carried the most significant sentencing exposure, up to 20 years per count under federal statutes. Combined with the theft and fraud charges, each defendant faced theoretical maximum sentences exceeding 40 years. Wickham's defense attorneys, retained within hours of his arrest, immediately began contesting the forensic document analysis. Their position was that the chain of custody for Manifest 07 NRF 3847 could not be established across an 18-year period that included multiple storage transitions and 2 separate digitization processes. If the forged page had been inserted after the document left Wickham's custody, by someone else, for some other purpose, their client could not be held responsible for its content. The argument wasn't without legal merit. The document had passed through multiple hands across nearly 2 decades. The forensic examiner's conclusion about insertion timing was based on ink chemistry and page binding analysis, not surveillance footage or witness testimony. A competent defense attorney could challenge the methodology. Here's the take that will probably get us some pushback. The real failure in this case wasn't Dale Wickham. It was the 2010 decision to close the file without ever formally serving the warrant that had been prepared. If that warrant had been executed, even without sufficient evidence for prosecution, it would have placed Wickham under documented federal scrutiny for the rest of his life. The financial structure he used to move $38 million would have been monitored. The Singapore transfers might have been flagged. The case might have concluded a decade earlier, before the hardware had been fully absorbed into the grey market and before any possibility of recovering physical evidence had closed. A dormant warrant isn't a backup plan. It's an abdication. The prosecution's response to the defense challenge on chain of custody was to request a hearing on the admissibility of the forensic document analysis. That hearing was scheduled for April 14th, 2026, in the Eastern District of Virginia. The presiding judge, a federal district court judge with a background in financial crimes, had handled 2 previous procurement fraud cases. The hearing proceeded as scheduled. The judge ruled in favor of admissibility on April 22nd, 2026, finding that the forensic methodology met the evidentiary standard under dormant. The chain of custody challenge was effectively neutralized. Raymond Eds entered a guilty plea on May 3rd, 2026, to 1 count of conspiracy and 1 count of wire fraud. As part of a cooperation agreement, he provided detailed testimony about the operational mechanics of the scheme. Specifically, the process by which he had cancelled the September 2007 inventory review and the financial arrangements through which he had received his share of the proceeds. His cooperation was expected to significantly strengthen the prosecution's case against Wickham and Pethick at trial. Gary Pethick entered a guilty plea on May 19th, 2026, to 1 count of conspiracy. His cooperation agreement included testimony about the Meridian coastal logistics structure and the specific process through which he had ensured the company's GSA credentials appeared clean to the receiving doc's verification systems. Both cooperating defendants were awaiting sentencing as of July 2026. Their sentencing hearings had been scheduled for September and October respectively, pending the outcome of the Wickham prosecution. Wickham himself had not entered a plea. As of the current date, he was represented by a 3-attorney defense team and had entered not guilty pleas on all counts. His trial date was set for November 2026 in the Eastern District of Virginia. The $38 million in components was never recovered. No request for mutual legal assistance to Singapore or Cyprus had produced recoverable assets. The buyers identified through the Cyprus Trading Company's partial records were entities that had themselves dissolved. The navigation hardware, classified systems designed for Pacific Fleet vessels, had been in the grey market long enough that its current location was, practically speaking, untraceable. The Navy's internal review, completed in March 2026, identified 17 procedural gaps in the 2007 cargo transfer process that had enabled the scheme. The review recommended changes to manifest verification protocols, records office access controls, and the administrative processes governing voluntary contractor dissolution. The recommendations were accepted, and implementation was underway. The NCIS agent, whose name had been forged on the manifest page, had been interviewed as part of the reopened investigation. He was 73 years old and had been retired for 11 years. He had no connection to the scheme and had never been aware that his name had been used. He described the notification as surreal. He was not a suspect at any point. The contract archivist Sandra Okafor received a formal commendation from NCIS in December 2025, prior to the arrests. The commendation cited her exceptional attention to documentary anomalies in the course of routine archival processing. She continued her contract work at the Portsmouth annex through the end of the calendar year. She wasn't an investigator. She wasn't looking for fraud. She was digitizing boxes. The entire case, 19 years of dormancy, $38 million in unrecovered government property, 3 federal defendants, traced back to one yellow sticky note on one page of one document in one box. The question of whether the 340 pallets of navigation hardware ever compromised the operational security of the vessels they were meant to support remains unanswered. The Pacific Fleet refit scheduled for late 2007 proceeded with replacement components procured through emergency authorization. The timeline impact was classified. The Navy has not publicly addressed whether the missing systems ever appeared in adversarial inventory. Will schemes like this surface again as the government accelerates legacy record digitization programs across agencies? Comment why yes or no, because there are thousands of boxes like the ones at Portsmouth still sitting in climate-controlled annexes across the country, and Sandra Okafor can't review all of them. The dormant warrant from 2010 was formally closed on February 7th, 2026 at 6:22 a.m., the moment Gary Pethick, the last of the 3 defendants, confirmed he was in federal custody. It had been active for 15 years, 11 months, and some number of days. Long enough that the investigators who prepared it had retired. Long enough that the loss it documented had been written off, absorbed, and forgotten by the institution that suffered it. Long enough that the man it named had built an entire second career and thought himself safe. The file was closed in 2010. The warrant never was. And on a Tuesday morning in February 2026, at 14 minutes past 6, it reached the door it had been written for. The hardware is gone. The money, what could be traced, has been documented and frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. The 3 men who built the scheme are in various stages of the federal judicial process. None of them have publicly spoken about what they did or why. The navigation systems they sold, classified hardware designed for vessels that may still be operating in the Pacific, are somewhere. Absorbed into a market that doesn't ask where equipment comes from. Installed on platforms that will never be inventoried against a manifest from Naval Station Norfolk in August 2007. That part of the case doesn't close neatly. It probably doesn't close at all. If this case interests you, the gap between what gets charged and what actually gets recovered, the way institutional memory fails and then occasionally comes back, subscribe. The next case in this series involves a similar pattern. A closed federal file, a decade of silence, and the one record that survived everything else.